Hello everyone and welcome to the Deep Dive. You know, we all experience weather every day. Today we're going to take a deep dive into this fascinating topic, exploring all those words we use, the idioms, the metaphors, and we're going to look at how weather shapes cultures around the world.
Well, that sounds exciting.
Yeah, you sent over some super interesting material from a podcast about learning English through weather vocabulary, and I'm so ready to dive in.
I think this will be a fun one. Imagine having all the tools to describe the weather in amazing detail, or to understand those funny English idioms, or even express your emotions with weather metaphors.
I love it.
It's all here in this deep dive.
So let's start with the basics. Words like sunny, cloudy, rainy, snowy, windy. Those are the building blocks.
Totally. These are like the universal starting points for any weather conversation.
Right. But then this podcast takes things a step further. It goes beyond just rain and gives us words like drizzle or downpour.
And that's where the magic happens. When you start using more precise language, you can paint a much richer picture for the listener.
Exactly. It's not just describing the weather anymore. It's creating an experience.
I agree.
Now, the fun part, in my opinion, is the idioms. Under the weather, every cloud has a silver lining, saving for a rainy day, those kinds of things.
Idioms are amazing. They add so much color and personality to language.
For sure. But have you ever thought about where they come from?
Yeah.
Like, why do we say raining cats and dogs when it's pouring?
Huh. You know, the origins of many idioms are actually a total mystery, which is kind of what makes them so interesting.
That's true. Makes you think.
It does. But some linguists have theories, for raining cats and dogs. Some believe it might be from Old Norse mythology, where they associated dogs with wind and cats with rain.
That's wild.
Isn't it? But no matter where they come from, I love how those idioms give us a glimpse into a culture's values and worldview.
Oh, absolutely. Like the saying, saving for a rainy day, really suggests that preparedness and resilience are important.
Yeah, great point. And that shows us how even these simple phrases can be super culturally significant, like little keys to understanding how people think and behave.
I never thought about it like that. That's really cool.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating.
Okay, so we've talked about words and idioms, but this podcast takes it a step further by exploring how we can use weather to express emotions. Things like a sunny disposition for happiness or being in a stormy mood.
Right. And what's really cool about those metaphors is that they connect those abstract feelings to something we can all experience, like weather.
I see what you mean.
We know what it feels like to be warmed by the sun or to feel the tension in the air before a thunderstorm.
Exactly.
And using those familiar images to describe our feelings allows us to communicate much more powerfully.
It's so true. It's way more interesting than just saying, I'm happy or I'm angry.
For sure. It just adds so much depth and richness to our language.
It's definitely more poetic.
And it helps us connect with others because we've all had those experiences.
I like that.
We don't need long explanations because those metaphors create an instant connection.
So it's not just about learning new words to sound smart. It's about using those words to really express yourself and connect with people.
Exactly. Spot on.
And speaking of connection, this podcast goes beyond English and takes us on a journey around the world, exploring all these different climates and how they have shaped cultures.
I love that. Going beyond the textbook and seeing how language is actually used.
Right. And how it reflects different ways of life, like how people live in different parts of the world.
Yeah. It's fascinating. Like the podcast talks about the scorching deserts and how they have influenced nomadic cultures in their storytelling.
Oh, wow.
Then it compares that with, say, the Inuit communities in the Arctic.
Okay.
And it talks about how they've thrived for centuries in such extreme conditions, and highlights how their languages have developed unique terms and expressions to describe the weather they face every day.
That makes you really appreciate how much weather is part of who we are,
Yeah.
It's not just something to talk about. It shapes our lives, our stories, even our identities.
Exactly. And the podcast gives some really fascinating examples. Like it talks about siestas and hot climates.
Oh, yeah. I've always wondered about those.
So it's not just a cultural thing. It's a practical adaptation to deal with that intense midday heat.
That makes sense.
And then it talks about the specialized clothing that Inuit communities wear.
Yeah.
That's not just about fashion. It's about surviving in those freezing temperatures.
Wow. So these adaptations can actually lead to unique traditions and cuisines, even architectural styles.
Absolutely. They're all connected.
It makes you want to travel the world and see it all.
Totally. And the podcast doesn't just describe different climates.
Oh.
It explores how we use weather imagery to describe things beyond the actual forecast.
Like when we say a storm of emotions to describe feeling overwhelmed.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's such a powerful metaphor, right?
It is.
It gets across the chaos and intensity so much better than just saying, I'm stressed. It's so much better.
And the podcast has a ton of examples like that.
Okay.
Showing how weather imagery just adds so much depth and nuance to our language.
Just like we're tapping into this universal language,
Right, like everyone gets it. And what's even more fascinating is how this metaphorical language can actually be different in different cultures.
How so?
Well, a culture that experiences monsoons all the time, they might have a whole bunch of metaphors based on those powerful rains
Interesting.
that wouldn't really resonate with someone from a drier climate.
I see what you mean.
So each culture kind of has its own unique weather vocabulary shaped by their experience and their relationship with nature.
That's a really cool point.
And understanding those differences can really help you understand different cultures better.
Yeah.
It's about going beyond the literal meaning of the words
Okay.
and appreciating those subtle ways that language reflects different ways of seeing and experiencing the world. So it's not just about knowing the forecast. It's like a gateway to understanding other cultures and perspectives and even ways of thinking.
Exactly. That's what I love about this podcast.
Me too.
It emphasizes that this understanding goes beyond just recognizing the different words and phrases.
Okay.
It's about knowing how to use them correctly.
Right. So it's not just about knowing the words. It's about knowing how to use them effectively.
Yes. Exactly. Like having all these language outfits in your closet.
I like that.
You pick the right one, depending on where you're going.
Okay.
You wouldn't wear a ball gown to a picnic, right? And you wouldn't use super technical weather jargon in everyday conversation.
I wouldn't. So the podcast stresses how important it is to adapt your language
Yes.
to suit your audience and what you're trying to say.
Exactly. It's about being able to code switch.
What's that?
Using different levels of formality and vocabulary depending on the situation.
Oh, okay.
And the podcast does a really great job of giving examples of how to do this well.
That's awesome. So like in a formal weather report, you might hear something like a low pressure system is moving in,
Right.
bringing with it a chance of precipitation. But in a normal conversation, you'd probably just say, it looks like rain later.
Exactly.
Two totally different ways of saying the same thing.
Right. It's about being a language chameleon, blending into different situations. And speaking of blending, I love how the podcast blends informative stuff with engaging stories.
Yeah, I was going to say that. It's not just a boring textbook on weather words.
No.
It's more like an adventure. And they use real world examples and funny stuff to make their points.
Right. And that makes it fun to listen to.
It keeps you hooked. It really does feel like a journey, discovering new words and concepts along the way.
And that's the best part about learning new languages.
It is.
It's not about memorizing rules.
Right.
It's about expanding your horizons,
Love it.
challenging what you thought you knew,
Yeah.
and seeing the world in a whole new way.
I'm starting to see how complex weather vocabulary really is.
It is.
It's more than just describing the weather.
Way more.
It's about understanding the cultural and emotional and even philosophical ideas behind the words.
I agree. And as we move into the last part of our deep dive, I think you'll see how the podcast ties all these ideas together.
Can't wait.
Yeah.
This has been so interesting. I feel like we've really gone deep on this topic, from basic weather words to cultural insights, and even how weather affects our language and emotions. What do you think is like the biggest takeaway from all this?
I think it's amazing how this podcast brings together language learning and cultural exploration.
Yeah.
It's not just about memorizing words, it's about getting a deeper understanding of how a culture connects with nature.
I totally agree. This podcast really shows how weather is such a big part of human experience.
It is.
From how we adapt to different climates, to how we use weather imagery to tell stories and express our feelings.
Right. And all of those things, those adaptations, they can create unique traditions, different cultural practices, and even ways of thinking. Like we said before, a culture with lots of monsoon seasons might have a ton of metaphors based on rain that wouldn't make sense in a dry climate.
It's so interesting how each culture has its own weather language.
It is, shaped by their unique connection to the natural world. And the podcast really encourages us to embrace that diversity.
Okay.
It reminds us that learning a language isn't just about the rules, it's about opening ourselves up to new ways of seeing the world.
It's about those little differences and realizing that even talking about the weather can give you insights into another culture.
Absolutely. And as we've seen, it's not enough to just recognize the words and phrases.
Right.
You have to know how to use them in the right context.
Like a phrase that's okay in casual conversation might sound weird in a formal setting.
Yeah. For example, you wouldn't say, "It's a scorcher out there," if you were on the news giving a weather report.
Totally.
The podcast really emphasizes how important it is to change your language to fit your audience.
And what you're trying to say.
Exactly. So you're communicating effectively.
So it's not enough to just know the words.
Yeah.
You have to know how to use them like a native speaker.
Yeah.
Understanding all the subtle things about when to use certain words.
Precisely. And the podcast gives us so many great examples to help us do that.
Cool.
It encourages us to really pay attention to those subtle shifts in language.
Right. Because effective communication is about more than just words. It's about the context.
Exactly. I think that's an important lesson, not just for language learning, but for communication in general.
I think so too. Be mindful of who you're talking to, what you want to say.
Right. And the nuances of the language you use.
As we're wrapping up, it really hits me how much this podcast is about the power of language
Yeah.
to connect with other people and to connect with the world. It's not just about talking. It's about understanding.
Yes. It's about making sense of our experiences and expressing our emotions and building relationships.
It's like language is a bridge that connects us to other cultures and different ways of thinking.
Beautifully said. And to that point, I'd like to leave everyone with this thought. How does the climate of your own region shape your everyday life, your culture, and even your language?
That's a good one.
Think about what unique weather sayings or metaphors are used in your community.
Exploring those questions can help you better understand the connection between language, culture, and the natural world.
Exactly. And remember, learning never stops. There's always more to discover.
So true. This deep dive has been amazing.
It has.
Thank you so much for taking us on this journey through weather vocabulary and showing us what it all means.
It was my pleasure. And thank you for your insights and awesome questions.
And to everyone listening, thank you for joining us on the deep dive. We hope you enjoyed exploring language and all these ideas. We'll see you next time for another deep dive into something awesome.